Hi, Renew Life Groups. Peter Cavanna here. Welcome back to the second of our two-part mini-series on empathy called The Comforters. Now, let's read again Job 2, verses 11 to 13. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, when they heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Let's begin this evening by talking about a third component of empathy that I think might be quite important. We've touched on it already, but let me develop it a little more. It's proximity. Proximity is a fancy word meaning that you're near, isn't it? These men got nearer. We read it earlier in verse 12. As they got nearer, when they saw him from a distance, they began to cry aloud and weep. As they got nearer, so it became more obvious that their friend was really at rock bottom. We have to draw near in order to really understand where people are at. Now, we have a curious thing in British culture that actually confuses sometimes people from other nationalities, but particularly other languages. I once met with a group of Argentinians, and they came to England. They were preachers. It was a missions team. And they learned that the way you say hello in English to people is to ask them if they are all right. Because everywhere they went, they'd learnt in their phrase book, hello. But instead of people saying hello, when they got to England, they heard people going, all right, yep, all right, yep. And when they tried to translate this back, they realized that everywhere they went, people were asking them if they were all right. Sometimes the answer to that question was even more bizarre, because the answer was not too bad. Well, when they went back and looked at the words, not too bad, they figured that everywhere in England, people were going up to one another, asking each other if they were all right. Clearly, they must have looked awful. To which the answer was not, I'm fine, but I'm not too bad. Can you imagine translating that back into Spanish for them? Well, we have this in our culture, don't we? Asking people, how are you? And it would be wonderful to think that when we ask people, how are you, that we meant it more than it just being a turn of phrase that we have come to use. I'd love it if when I asked you, how are you, you felt able to tell me the truth. And so we don't tell everyone in our lives the truth, at least not like that. We're not that honest. And I don't think we're supposed to tell everyone our deepest and darkest thoughts. Sometimes it's not other people's business to know how we are. But we know that in our lives there are some people with whom we should build relationships that are much, much closer than normal, with whom we can be completely honest. Well, this must be the case in the church, mustn't it? It's one of the reasons why churches develop small groups, to allow there to be relationships that can grow. And that doesn't mean that everyone in your life group is your best friend, but perhaps there ought to be some people in the group with whom perhaps you can be a little bit more honest about how you really are doing than the everyday man in the street. It's interesting that as these men got nearer to Job, they noticed with their eyes how rock bottom he was. Now today, quite often we're all quite good at acting, and often it will be, actually, we will pick up where people are at with our ears as much as with our eyes, i.e. spending time with people, having coffee with them. It's been an interesting couple of years with the coronavirus pandemic. One day we'll all get back to normal and we will be able to go to Bear and sit and talk. We will be able to have coffee together again. But even if it's over the phone, even if it's on Zoom, there's a way in which we can use our ears to know how are people really doing. And so we want to create a culture where there is proximity, where we can have people that we can trust and entrust ourselves to and be specially connected to them. Even Jesus had a sort of a set of circles of trust. He especially loved John. He was especially close to Peter, James, and John. He discipled the 12 and he preached to the crowd. But I'm not sure he would have revealed to the crowd everything about himself. These things were for those who drew close to him. And it's the same with me and you. Now, what I don't want to do is unleash a spirit of grumbling. And so I would just want to remind you that grumbling is not a fruit of the Spirit. But aside from people who are just generally a bit gloomy, I'm not so much talking about that. We do want to have, don't we, some real honest forums in which we can talk honestly about how we're feeling. And that's going to require us to be close to one another. And if we can't do it physically, then we can find some other way in order to do that. Here are some scriptures for you. Matthew 9:36, Jesus, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. Right? So it's when he got nearer that he was able to, his heart was moved by them. We've got to get near people. Jesus wept when he arrived at the funeral of his friend Lazarus. We're not to suppose that he wept on the journey, but when he got there, when he saw the people, he was moved. Hebrews 2:18, because he himself suffered, he was tempted. When he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. There's that empathy again in the life of Jesus. Hebrews 4:15, the writer says, we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. So, number 3, when it comes to empathy, it's going to require us to get close to people in order to give them that special gift of our comfort. All right, the 4th component of empathy is painful. Job 2:12 again. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. They began to weep aloud. Well, time does not permit me to talk about how culturally unacceptable that would have been for these rather sage-like men to behave like this. Clearly, when they saw their friend, it was painful. Maybe that's one of the reasons why sometimes we shy away from empathy, because it is so very painful. And yet we are called, as we said last time, to carry one another's burdens. Don't be afraid that being empathetic, don't be afraid when it becomes a painful process. It's supposed to be that. Perhaps if there is no pain, perhaps it's not really empathy. Now, nobody wants pain. And perhaps it's worth saying this, that some people, listen to me carefully now, some people perhaps have got so much going on in their lives that perhaps they are not the people right now who need to be involved with helping others in this way. You know, the blind cannot lead the blind. They both fall into a ditch. Now, it's true that those that have recovered from being at rock bottom, they're familiar with what rock bottom looks like, and they do want to help other people there. In fact, they, in my experience, I'm sure your experience too, when people have suffered a lot, they become much more compassionate often. They now understand, and they want to help other people. Sometimes I think they're sort of helping themselves that they see in others. I think that's great. We're turning our struggles into a power, into a superpower that helps other people. I saw that a lot with some of my students at Malice Hall. But it might well be that you don't have the capacity right now to carry other people's burdens. You already have enough that you are carrying. However, for most of us, we have a little bit of capacity. We've got a little bit of extra that maybe we can lend a hand to others. Jesus said, of course, it is more blessed to give than to receive in Acts chapter 20 and verse 35. Proverbs 11 verse 25 says this: he who refreshes others shall himself be refreshed. Empathy is painful, but that's all part of fellowship. It's all part of the communion of the saints, that we are one body. Paul said it in a couple of ways. Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. 1 Corinthians 12:26, if one part suffers, one part of the body suffers, then every part suffers with it. And maybe that's why, and I begin to conclude with our fifth component of empathy, that empathy ought to be, where possible, plural. There were 3 friends that came to help Job. 3. In fact, if you read to the end of the book, you'll see that a 4th one pops along as well. So there's 3/4 of them there helping Job at rock bottom. When you're carrying something very heavy, it normally needs a team. Why is it that when you're carrying furniture, you normally can't do it by yourself? Because it's too heavy. Empathy should be, as best as possible, a plural activity. That's why it should be done on purpose, and that's why it needs a team. They decided, all 3 of them, that they were going to go and help him. Do you remember the story in Mark chapter 2 where it says that 4 men carried another man to Jesus on a stretcher? 4 carried him. That's why they perhaps had the extra capacity to rip open the roof. Now, I often wonder if only one of them had carried him, maybe he would have needed healing too by the time he got to Jesus. No, it took a team to carry that man to Jesus. And this is going to need teamwork as well. We want to have healing We don't want to have burnout. How often do you see an ambulance go by, or paramedics, and it's only one? No, there's normally a team. It's normally 2 paramedics, a number of people that are in the ambulance, 2 there. And so as we go and help people, can I encourage us to go in plural form, you and others, and that way we'll be able to help one another and not burn out. If 4 of us can carry the stretcher, then we can for sure bring that patient to Jesus. So let me conclude this series with these components again. That it should be plural, that it will be by necessity, it will be painful. That of course it requires proximity. We're going to have to get near to people. That it should be purposeful, part of our DNA. But most of all, that it should be peaceful, that we will help carry one another's burdens. May the Lord bless you as you think these things through and pray about them tonight.